let's go over a bit about my XR150L sleeper build with the backdrop of me riding it on my commute to work. In this video, I want to share my honest opinion on the ways this build excels and the ways in which it still sucks. So we have to start with the cost on this project. It has had a few iterations, so this will just be the cost of what's currently thrown on there. The big bore I have in there cost me $423.50 all said and done because I had to do some extra things to make it commuter friendly, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. The camshaft I have in there can be had for $79.99. I had to use an $18 intake adapter. The carburetor I'm using cost $115. I had to use a $13 throttle cable. Materials for my custom intake totaled $57. The air filter I'm using cost $22. And the rear shock I'm guessing would cost about $450, but I don't know exactly yet. More on that in a sec. So that's $1,181.40. That's expensive. Like I said, this project has gone through a few iterations, so I'm going to share the major components I ended up with and why. So I'm currently running the 68mm big bore from SX Parts, the S23 camshaft from Scooter Swap Shop, a 26mm OKO carburetor from Mid-Atlantic Trials, a custom intake back to the original airbox, an unnamed aftermarket rear shock prototype, and barely tuned forks. For the big bore, I actually had both the 68mm SX Parts kit and the 70mm Scooter Swap Shop kit on hand, and ended up going with the SX Parts kit because just comparing the two, overall the SX Parts kit was the one I would rather run on this build. The two kits are very, very different. And there's pros and cons to each, but going over those differences is a huge rabbit hole, so we're not going to get into that just yet. For the cam, I had both the SX Parts Stage 2 cam and Scooter Swap Shop S23 camshaft on hand to choose from. I ran both of them, but decided to stick with the S23 camshaft because the bottom end performance is unbelievable and really makes the engine work super well off-road, especially with taller gearing than stock. I have a bunch of carburetors to choose from, but ended up sticking with the 26mm OKO. 28 works too, but the 26 is overall better since it tunes in easier and has better characteristics in the low and mid RPM. The forks are currently just running slightly higher viscosity oil and slightly more of it just to prevent them from bottoming in a super harsh manner like they were in the stock tune, because I noticed at the last teardown that they were becoming damaged from all the bottoming. So currently they actually aren't working any better, they're just not destroying themselves. The rear shock is a complete aftermarket solution, and this is the test build of that solution. This was pretty much my only option for a meaningful improvement to the rear end at the time, and it does work very, very well, so that's why I'm sticking with this for now. So, how well is it all working? Well, I really had two goals for the build, so I'd like to compare it against those. First, I wanted to make the bike way, way more powerful. I really just wanted it to be substantially, measurably, obviously more powerful because I had started growing bored of the stock setup, and small gains were not going to do the trick. Did we achieve that? Oh yeah, the difference was already substantial, measurable, and obvious in the first video I did after installing the first set of components without even doing much tweaking, where it accelerated 0 to 60 in less than 1/3 of the time it took when stock, and that wasn't really dialed in and didn't even have changes to the gearing yet. So that goal was too easy, and even though I did make changes to detune the setup over time, the power is still very nice and easily satisfies my desire for performance out of the engine. My other goal was to make the bike capable of taking the long way home. Basically, there's a longer route to get to work that goes up a 9,000-foot pass, and the stock bike couldn't really handle it the few times I tried. It would simply run out of power on some of the climbs. Not even just running out of momentum and not making the climbs because of ending up spinning the wheel or something like that. It would quite literally just not have enough power to keep turning the wheel on the steepest parts of the trail. So I'd have to creatively and painstakingly do switchbacks up the climbs while making the clutch squeal. And now, even with the taller gearing, it just walks right up those climbs without struggling. And it does so much more controllably and comfortably thanks to having a million times better rear suspension. So that's nice too. And yeah, that goal was too easy as well. The only thing I'm not entirely happy with yet is the front suspension, but that's because I haven't given it my full attention yet. Once I do, I'm sure I'll have it working way better without spending too much more. There's a lot of upside to doing a build like this then. because it's really at a point where I do not feel like I'd ever get rid of it. This thing handles commuting very well still, even better than before because it doesn't struggle to keep up with cars, and it's even still averaging 62 miles per gallon for commuting and 50 miles per gallon for shredding, which isn't bad. I could definitely go adventuring on it, practically without limitation now since it's not going to beat the crap out of me off-road anymore, and it no longer just completely runs out of power in certain situations. It now does well enough as a straight-up dirt bike that it's the one I grab 80% of the time if I'm going to go out back and hit some trails. And why do I grab it that often? Because it's now highly capable. It's super lively, and I feel like I'm pushing myself rather than being constantly at the limit of the bike, and that means it doesn't get boring. For someone who's been riding as much as I have, that's basically saying the potential is quite high. So if we're just looking at all that, considering the final outcome and how it feels and even measurably performs many times better than the original bike, while only costing a small fraction of what the whole bike costs, without having to switch to a whole different bike platform and deal with all the titling, registration, and insurance stuff, well then, it seems well worth it to do a build like this, right? Well, no, because this is the part where I tell you not to do something like this if you own an XR150L. Because amongst all the positives, there's some very, very serious downsides that cannot be ignored. And there's objectively better options that cost less money, less time, and don't absolutely nuke the value of the bike. The biggest, most annoying negative that came with this build is the fact that it is now 9 months since I started the build, and I'm still not done with it. Instead of just thoroughly enjoying the bike for those 9 months, I've been doing this thing where I'll ride it a bit, decide it needs some change, and then spend half a day making changes, and that cycle seems to just repeat endlessly. If I had more time to mess with it, it wouldn't have taken so long, but on average, I have 3 days off of work per month, so I spend my free time carefully. Another annoyance and major reason against doing a build like this is the time that the bike will be down. With limited free time, yet the desire to make the build work exactly how I want it to, on several occasions I've torn something down and then run out of time, and not had time to continue what I was doing for an entire month before I get back to it. So the bike just sat there not being used for the whole time. I had other bikes to ride during that time, but if it was my only bike, that would be something I just wouldn't tolerate. The dollar cost of the build already seems high, but that $1,181 price is only accounting for what's actually still on the build. There has been plenty of other components that went in, then got switched out, so the total cost would actually be higher because the build has gone through so many changes. So that stated cost I give is the most optimistic cost for this build. There is also the fact that my bike is worthless for resale in its current state, if I did ever want to sell it. So you don't only lose the money that gets sunk into the parts, you lose the value that's in the bike. Nobody wants a modified bike, especially not one that has a super slappy cam that sounds like it just might explode. This particular build would be relatively easy to put back to stock, but that would be another day spent wrenching rather than doing something else. While the bike may still be getting decent MPG, so it seems like its utility value hasn't been ruined, it also now absolutely requires premium fuel, which is 18% more expensive per volume, which is a substantial hit to the utility value of the bike. Not to mention, the reliability of the current setup is unknown, and it will have to gain my trust again over the next 14,000 miles, which is roughly the amount of mileage I did on the stock setup. So at the end of the day, can I really recommend doing a build like this? I'd have to say I could only recommend it if going through the build process itself is your goal. If you just want to tinker and tweak your bike and just enjoy doing a build, then sure, yes, the XR150L is a very rewarding platform to modify because there is so much room for improvement. So the gains are all huge, obvious, and transformative. Otherwise, if you want a practical upgrade, the KLX 230S is an easy platform to switch over to from the XR150L and won't cost much, if anything, after selling the XR150L. But let's say you're dead set on keeping the XR150L, but you still want some improvement. You could keep things practical and just do the most high payoff changes only, which would be just dropping in a big bore and rear shock when one is available, and then doing a quick and dirty tune on the front end. Nothing else, no supporting mods, and you'll get 80% of all the improvement I got out of my build at half the price or less. And it won't look or sound modified, so you'll be retaining the value of the bike, but it'll perform like a different bike. But anyway, that's just all my thoughts on this build. What would you do? Build your bike out? Do a sensible mild build? Or just get a different bike?